All right, everybody, welcome into OGP, the One Giant Podcast. Bit of a, we're going to call pre-show banter. Why don't we? Before we go into the full podcast, which will have Andrew Makowitz back in the building coming up in a little bit. We're going to talk about where the contracts sit, obviously, with Barkley and with Daniel Jones, what it means for this team. And we've had these discussions specifically around Daniel Jones for a number of days in the past couple of weeks here. But now the other element, too, I think, is when we look inside the draft, what does that mean for this team? What does it mean the way the board could unfold at the top and what the Giants will do at 25? There's a lot of variables for Big Blue to kind of sort through here. And it's starting to happen in somewhat short order here with some of those deadline dates coming up. Before we dive in on all of that, though, do let you know that if you have been, and I've seen the people have been, going over and subscribing to the Substack, Adam.Armbrecht, you're going to see a couple of write-ups over there on Rashee Rice, on Jonathan Mingo. Got two more, at least one more, maybe two more. Want to get to Nathaniel Dell as well, Tank Dell coming out of Houston there at the wide receiver position. But then we're going to turn over, I think, to linebackers here. There's a couple of guys in that first round area that I want to at least highlight a name or two there and then get back into the middle of the draft as well, where I've already kind of honed in on one or two names that I like, I think are good fits, I think are good values. So we'll start to talk about them over on Substack. And then what we'll bring to the OGP podcast is just going to be the big board and where do we stand right now, right? Some wide receivers, some linebackers, offensive linemen. How are we going to get this organized where the Giants can address their issues and needs without putting themselves in a difficult spot, knowing that the impending contract with Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley potentially, and other moves that they make on this roster, there's going to be some restrictions there. But as everybody gets in here, a friendly just reminder here, two things. One, sorry about the delay on the previous episode that we had scheduled. Had to shift that around a little bit for some technical issues. But on the other side of it, we are going to address all the same things we're going to talk about there. And then we'll continue to roll forward. And OGP, when are we going to do a mock draft? So I'd like to do one of those early next week, I think. I think that'll be the plan. Some chance over the weekend, but most likely next week. So get over to Substack, see some of the other names we're putting out there, and then we'll get some of them fleshed out as well. But I think a mock draft next week will be just a good sample size to say, hey, if we roll through this as it stands right now, not knowing free agency just yet, even in consideration of what could or couldn't happen with Daniel Jones, how would we feel about things going forward? So this is the preamble to the full episode when Andy will join us here coming up in a little while. But there was one other thing that I thought would be fun and maybe isn't, fully integrated into the conversation we're going to have. It's a little bit of context, I think, around Daniel Jones, the contract that he's seeking, and what potentially could be coming down the road for other quarterbacks around the league. And what I mean by that is I went over to Spot Track, and they provide you with the market values on a lot of different positions and key players around the NFL. And I find it fascinating. So we know that right now, like speculation is, Daniel Jones and his new agent, they're going to end up asking for $45 million. I don't think that that's even going to be the reported initial ask. I think it's probably 40, but it's going to be significantly higher than the New York Giants probably initially anticipated. So when you go over to Spot Track, we'll go in ascending order here. $26.2 million, a 3 for $78 million deal for Daniel Jones. That's where they put his market value at. Now, you can say, based on some factors of when he's hitting the market and who's in free agency, hey, there's going to be a push here, and what it's going to look like going forward over the next few seasons when it comes to other contracts that are going to come up. We know the Herberts, the Burrows of the world. Trevor Lawrence is coming up here too after a really good season. So there's going to be a lot of factors, and that's a good thing. But the Giants have to balance that, ratio of saying paying Daniel Jones for what we think he's worth right now, what he could be worth going forward, and what he's worth relative to the rest of the market. Here's the interesting thing, though. Jimmy Garoppolo over on Spot Track, $34.9 million average annual, 4 for $139. Above him, Derek Carr, another big name being attached potentially to our stadium brothers, the New York Jets, 37.7, 3 years, 113 for Carr. Just pause right there for a second, because what's going to happen is, and this is what I really find fascinating about it, Daniel Jones is becoming, potentially, depending on where these negotiations go, he's going to become the table setter for the next 5 to 10 QB contracts that get signed going forward here. And all of the quarterbacks that we're going to talk about, at least, and this is only 2 more on this list that we're going to highlight, but these are all guys that, for the most part, have a longer track record, have a better track record than Daniel Jones. There's one here, actually, that we'll mention that's an outlier. But when you see that Daniel Jones is being put out there at $26.2 million over a 3-year deal, if he gets $30 million, $32 million, which is the franchise number, so you probably have to clear that to really make a difference in the overall league perspective. But say that it's closer to, I think it's going to be closer to 36, 37 million, something in that range. Well, right off the bat there, Jimmy Garoppolo, whatever you think he isn't, injury problems, whether or not he's a quarterback that can definitely take you on a deep playoff run and win a championship with, guess what? He's not going to take 35 million if Daniel Jones is making 36, 37. He's going to command, and rightfully so, a higher pay scale than what Daniel Jones is. Now, the ceiling of Jimmy Garoppolo from here going forward versus Daniel Jones, that's irrelevant. Because, again, we're talking about, are these going to be 3-year deals for Daniel Jones, a 4-year deal for Jimmy Garoppolo? So depending on where he's going and what the expectations are, but this is a guy who's been to the playoffs. He's been a very good regular season quarterback over the course of his career. Again, injuries are a factor, sure. But if Jones gets 36, Garoppolo's going for 38, 39. And then you go up to Derek Carr. Now, I think they're probably, those guys are a little bit more similar. And I think it'd be interesting to hear the way fans think about, or the way teams that are being talked about being linked to these guys, how would they feel about, you could have Jimmy G or you could have Derek Carr. And relative might be, well, what's the length of the contract? What's the average salary of that contract? And what team am I coming from? Like the Jets, if I'm in the Jets' shoes, I might prefer Jimmy Garoppolo just because he guarantees you probably regular season victories, consistency, as long as he's healthy. Now, whether or not you think Derek Carr gives you better upside, playoffs, etc. But just based on the hierarchy of what they have on Spot Track, Daniel Jones goes for 35, Garoppolo's going for 38, 39. If he's going for 38, 39, then Derek Carr is going to be pushing for 40, 41, 42. And then above that, this is a weird one. I call this the outlier. Geno Smith. Now, again, this is a very, very high number. The total contract is $78 million. The average annual is $39.3. So this is a guy who obviously had a tremendous season. We know that. Hasn't had the track record, has bounced around the league, hasn't been a starter, but really showed you something here. And there's already been speculation that a lot of coordinators attached to him who are now in Tampa Bay, maybe all of a sudden, there could be a little bit of a bidding war there potentially, which could change the dynamic of how Seattle looked at it and even how Geno looked at it at the end of the year. They gave me a chance in Seattle. I want to stay in Seattle. I want to reward them. They rewarded me. But even overlook him. Then we get to one Mr. Lamar Jackson. 40.7 is the average annual. 6 years for 244 for Lamar Jackson. I'm going to tell you right now, it's 45. The second that you see these things start to escalate up, there's no way that Lamar Jackson is going to sign a $40 million contract if he has any of Derek Carr, Jimmy Garoppolo within $1 or $2 million of him. Because while Derek Carr is a starter in the NFL, he can win you football games. Age is a factor. Success rate is a factor, right? Lamar Jackson is an NFL MVP. It goes without saying. He is in a different stratosphere than Derek Carr, than Jimmy Garoppolo. Injury concerns? Sure. But at the same time, the talent dictates that this is going to be a player that gets paid significantly on that market. Now, whether it's through a trade, we understand. There's a lot of mechanics involved with Lamar Jackson. But it's fascinating to think that even if at a minimum, Daniel Jones is going to command $10 million average over expectation, that's going to shift everybody. It's not going to shift everybody 10 million above. We're not going to look and say, well, then it's, although maybe, Lamar at 50 million. And this is the thing where I think people look and they say, NFL QB contracts and where things currently sit. If you sat there and said, we'll pull these up right now. If you're going to sit there and say, well, Patrick Mahomes, he's making the average of 45. Okay. And Josh Allen is making the average of 43. But we know, first of all, Patrick Mahomes, the 10-year contract, right? $450 million, nearly $500 million for him, right? That certainly matters. Russell Wilson, I mean, you can make the case, right? The 48 million, that was certainly something that you're going to look back on now and feel a little bit different about. And put these into the correct order. Aaron Rodgers, 50 million, 48 and change for Russell. Kyler Murray, 46, 46 for Watson. Mahomes, 45, 43 for Josh Allen, and then 40 for Dak Prescott. So when we talk about like where this market's going to head here, you have to understand like some of these quarterbacks are going to come up for renegotiations, not Mahomes. I think the Deshaun Watson one, in my personal opinion, hopefully it ends up being a disaster. I heard Keith McPherson, who we did a crossover on with the Locked On Nets podcast, heard him over on WFAN saying, like, I hope that becomes the worst contract in the history of the NFL, because some guys I don't think deserve to be rewarded in such a way. And Cleveland certainly took a massive gamble on a player like that, on a person like that, I should say. But when you look at these numbers, remember, like, go down the list. Jared Goff is making $33 million. Kirk Cousins signed the 1-year, $35 million deal. But when they come up, the numbers are going to continue to escalate. The idea that Carson Wentz or even Matt Ryan, $30 million. Ryan Tannehill made $29.5 million on this past season on a 4-year, 118. At some point, you have to reconcile the fact that whatever you think the number should be, it's all relative to what the market is. And that was a big point that I just wanted to drive home here, is that the numbers look different based on where the NFL is going, based on the money that's coming in. So, $50 million for Aaron Rodgers 2-3 years ago is a seismic number relative to your cap, relative to where you can spend. But that number gets smaller over time. It becomes less significant. I'm going to ask a question when we get in with Andy here, just about where that position has gone and the expectations around it. But when you look at it, it is, to me, pretty fascinating to think about Daniel Jones potentially earning a contract in the neighborhood of $36 million, and then watching Jimmy G, Derek Carr. I think Geno Smith's number is so high as it is right now that might not change at all. Lamar Jackson being impacted by it. And then the rolling numbers behind there when we talk about other guys that are going to come up. And that's the Trevor Lawrences of the world, Joe Burrow, going to pass past Trey Lance, going to pass past Tua as well, given some of his health concerns. But then you get down to the Justin Herberts of the world. And obviously, we're also going to see a guy like, who's going to be left down there? Kenny Pickett's a few years away. He'll have to show something, but he's already, he's got the 4-year, 14, only making a little $3.5 million. What a bargain. $3.5 million for Geno Smith this past year. What a bargain. If you can get it, I highly recommend it, right? So it is just fascinating. It is fascinating to me. I find it to be a pretty unique set of circumstances that could be coming down the pike here. Let's take a little bit of a pause here. Andy Makowitz is going to join us. We'll kick off the official podcast episode. This was just a nice little context, I think. And now we're going to talk about Daniel Jones specifically when it comes to the number and what matters most about that contract number, Saquon Barkley, and where the reports stand right now on him, and then discuss the draft as well. And we will, Dan, I see you there in the conversation. We will about tagging or signing. We'll talk about that here coming up in a minute as we dive into the full seismic OGP episode. Thank you for everybody coming in here. Apologies again for that delay on our episode that was scheduled for yesterday morning. We finally got this thing back on track. I think this actually moved twice in terms of when we planned to get this particular episode up and out to you. We're back here in just one moment. Coming up, the New York Football Giants have big decisions to make this offseason. Where will the Daniel Jones contract ultimately land? Is Saquon Barkley further away from being a Giant than closer? And what does all this mean when we take a look at the top end of the draft and the big moves the Giants want to make? Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant podcast, where we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. He's healthy. He's wealthy. He's wise. He's back up on the horse. He's riding again strong. Andy, how are we, sir?
Oh, Adam, I'm doing great. Recharged the batteries, feeling good, but man, I couldn't stay away. The offseason has so much intrigue already. I mean, if you just look at Giants Twitter, it feels like the world is crumbling beneath us, and it is a house divided right now.
It's interesting, man. So the little preamble we did to the show was just laying in some of the context around league contracts, guys that are up for contracts at the QB position specifically, and how Daniel Jones maybe can impact that. So if you're listening on the podcast, go over to YouTube, subscribe over there, and you'll get that full conversation. But over here, we're going to go ahead and dive in a little bit deeper on these kind of contexts. So you and I have been talking before we were going to get on, and I think there is the most important factor in all of this when it comes to Daniel Jones. You mentioned fan base. Like, do I find it weird that fans that say Daniel Jones, the franchise quarterback, and are now saying, well, not for $40+ million, he's not a franchise quarterback? I do. I find it odd. That sounds a little bit closer to me saying I'm evaluating him. I want to see him get better. But your biggest factor is not the contract. It's about what is the average? What is the front-loaded money that's going to be spent on Daniel Jones?
Yeah, we asked this on Twitter, One Giant Podcast on Twitter. We asked everyone out there because there's this outrage about the exact dollar amount that Daniel Jones is going to get, whether it's 35, 38, 41. They're saying Daniel Jones wants 45, some whatever crazy number it is. But do people actually care more about what the average annual contract value is? Or do they care what the cap hit is? And Adam, to me, the answer is very simple. The whole idea of not wanting to use the franchise tag or the non-exclusive franchise tag for just over $32 million is that $32 million gets absorbed into year one salary cap completely, right? And if the Giants actually sign Daniel Jones to a longer term deal, there are ways to turn things into signing bonuses, add void years down the road when the salary cap is expected to balloon with new TV contracts. So for me, Adam, it seems like people are all up in a tizzy at Daniel Jones getting $37 million. But if his cap hit ends up being, I don't know, 19 or $20 million, then all of a sudden Joe Schoen has the ability to maybe address the Saquon Barkley situation or go out and get a $10 million plus impact player at a key position.
So we're going to talk about Barkley here in a second, but I agree with you. First of all, I agree with you, right? It is all relative to where the numbers are. I think it's also all relative to where the league is going. Like, again, the $40 million contract, literally, by the way, this offseason, as I laid it out before, there's 3 other quarterbacks that are going to make significantly more than that if Jones moves the needle up. And then over the next few years with Burrow, with Trevor Lawrence coming, with Justin Herbert, there's all these other names that are going to come in. They're going to make more money. And then Daniel Jones will settle back down. My more interesting question here, because first of all, I think you're right. If they come out and they say, hey, it's whatever, a $220 million contract and the first year cap hit is 20, no one's going to care. Everyone's happy. Great. Do you find it interesting, though? And this is all speculative. I want to make that clear. Like, I don't think the first ask is actually 45, but I think it's significantly higher than where the Giants thought it was going to be, right? They thought these negotiations were going to be pretty smooth, and I think they're maybe at least going to be a little more difficult for both sides. Do you think that it's indicative at all about how the Giants feel about Daniel Jones, about where they stand on him? Because if we believe that Joe Schoen is the right GM for this job, and we all agree that Brian Daboll is a great head coach, by the way, AP Coach of the Year, and also a great offensive coach, do you think that there's an internal discussion now saying, regardless of the average annual, hey, are we going to spend $220 on Daniel Jones? Brian, look around the room, look around free agency, look around the draft. Can we accomplish close to the same thing with another far cheaper quarterback at that position?
So it's a very good question, Adam. And the first thing that I think about is Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll almost a year ago today made the decision to decline Daniel Jones's fifth-year option at $22 million. So going into the season, they said, well, he's fine because he's on the roster and we don't have any other better options right now, but we're not going to commit to him long term. A
Yeah.
funny thing happened, though, on the way to the Giants winning a playoff game is that, like, Brian Daboll's coaching, Kafka's scheming, and Daniel Jones's ability to not turn over the ball and play a little bit smarter than he has previously led to Daniel Jones actually, like, looking good. The team overachieving, the team making the playoffs, winning a playoff game where Daniel Jones was a force multiplier in this situation.
Oh,
And
baby,
so
there's
now
that term.
you have to look at it and say, are Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll sitting here saying our mind has changed from a year ago? Or, are they saying, listen, it was a great run. Now we have the opportunity to pick the quarterback of our choice. Maybe there's someone with more upside, or we could build through the draft. There's a whole host of questions that happen, but I think you saw what their intentions were a year ago, Adam. Clearly, those have changed with people like Jordan Renan saying no matter what, they'll find a way to keep Daniel Jones in the building.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, first of all, it was the right choice back then. Like anyone, this is the one thing you can't do too. And we talk about this a lot on the Nets podcast with everything that goes on and signings and trades and draft capital and all this stuff, right? Oh, was it a mistake to bring in the superstars? Nope. It was always the right move. It didn't work out. Likewise, Daniel Jones was unproven. Was it right to decline the fifth-year option? 100%. Now, in this moment, do you look back and go, just a little over 20 million, huh? Well, that wouldn't have minded having that number here for one more year. But yeah.
Well, Adam, I was gonna say, I consider myself someone that is a little bit more biasly positive about Daniel Jones. Like I do,
Fair.
I would love to see him here. We can get into like the differences at a later date. But even me in last offseason said that you just can't
Right.
extend the qualifying offer. So even the people that were the most positive about Daniel Jones understood the business side of things. There was no way, based on what he had shown through the first 3 years of his career, that you were ever going to pick up this fifth-year option. Yes, in hindsight, it would look really nice right now to have Daniel Jones at $22 million.
Okay, so let's cap this off in an interesting way. First, do you think there's any world where any team would be giving up 2 first-round picks for Daniel Jones on the non-exclusive, as we understand it?
That is a great question. I would probably say no.
That'd be my inclination, right? Because I think he's unproven enough, and it's just depend. But by the way, it depends, right? Well, if it was the 31st pick in the first round for a couple of years, maybe you would. But guess what? Those teams, the Kansas City Chiefs, don't need a quarterback, right? So it looks a little bit different on teams like that. When you talk about mid first round picks, I think that's a lot harder. And you'd be saying 32.5 million, then you negotiate with them. What does the contract look like? That was the first quick question. Here's my other one. Blind taste test for you, Andrew. If I told you there's 2 quarterbacks, one has a 64% completion percentage over the course of his career, both have been in the league the same number of years. The other one has 63. A touchdown to interception ratio, 60 to 34 versus 44 to 15. And a passer rating, 86.6 versus 93.1. If you were out there shopping at the market, would you be willing to pay for QB1 in that scenario, say 3 times more than QB number 2?
I like the picture that you painted. I think the difficult thing is we can go like 2, 3, 4, 5 years back and see what people did, but like where are these players trending is also another question. Like, what was the last year just as equal? Because you're not necessarily paying for past performance. I think that's where people get in trouble. You're thinking about what are we paying for moving forward, right?
And incidentally, that's the thing about, like, if you tag Daniel Jones and then he has another blow up, big blow up year or whatever, and you go, well, now we're paying, okay, like you can always continue to massage this thing down the road, which is where I think it probably ends for Daniel Jones and the Giants. However, that's Gardner Minshew, the other quarterback. And the reason why I bring him up is it's a strikingly similar kind of scenario when he was in Jacksonville. It's a bad team, doesn't have weapons, terrible coaching. He actually was a pretty consistent and productive quarterback. And I only bring it up to say it's hard for there to be a scenario here where Daniel Jones, quote, walks, right? Like that's not something that's going to happen here. But the world where Daniel Jones is not the Giants quarterback, I do go in the direction of just saying, hey, remember, this was an overachieving year for the team collectively. And if Joe Schoen is looking at it as we still have a long way to go, well, paying a quarterback 15 million versus 40 million average over the life of a contract can make a big difference into how roster construction looks and what you can do going forward. This isn't me saying Gardner Minshew is hands down equal or better than Daniel Jones, but that I do believe is the way, isolated, objective from this situation. That's the way franchises and GMs look at things: dollars, productivity, and what is the timeline of our franchise.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, and I've always liked Gardner Minshew. I feel like he kind of got a little bit of a raw deal in Jacksonville. Feels like he could be a back end starter in this league. I fully agree with you on that. And to your point, if you're spending $10 to $12 million on Gardner Minshew, or $35 million on someone like Daniel Jones or Derek Carr or someone like that,
Right.
do you feel like you're getting 80% of the production for a third of the contract costs? Those are things that you have to weigh. And I do like that too, because I think one of the big problems people have is, for anyone that does not want Daniel Jones, that's fine. Like, I'm in Joe Schoen we trust territory. I am a Giants fan. I'm not necessarily a Daniel Jones solely fan. I think the answer is, if you don't want Daniel Jones at, say, $32 million or on a long-term deal, the question is always, okay, then what is the plan?
Yep.
Right. And some people say, well, I don't know what it is, but I don't want him. And that's not necessarily the right answer. If you came to me and said, we're putting all our chips in the Anthony Richardson basket or Hendon Hooker basket, and we're going to trade multiple picks, and this is the guy for our future. If Joe Schoen wants that and Brian Daboll wants that, I'm very happy with that. The thing I struggle with, Adam, is the idea of, like, let's just have Tyrod Taylor out there next year, or let's bring in Jacoby Brissett for a cup of coffee, or even Gardner Minshew as a placeholder right now. It just feels uninspired to me. Like, I want them to either go get their quarterback of the future or commit to Daniel Jones. This little, like, purgatory thing of just, like, retreading a guy that's going to get you 6 to 7 wins doesn't feel like the team is trending in the right direction, but I understand there's other roster spots that need some love too.
Yeah, and I think the difference is just there that, like, where is this team? Are they ready to be a playoff team again next year and the year after that, and then see what happens when you get to the playoffs? Or does Joe Schoen view it as, we overachieved, we're probably a year away from really being competitive ready, and at that point, while you'd like to get an Anthony Richardson or a hooker that could fall to you, quite frankly, not have to spend extra capital, if you wanted to, that's great. But you can also say, well, what's the next draft class look like? Where are we a year from now? All that good stuff. And I mean, again, because someone did bring it up here, Dan, in the chat about Tyrod, like, in the world where Tyrod, this is where I think, to your point, whatever version of it would look like, you want to have someone else competing. That's the bottom line. Right. You don't want to walk into the season saying Tyrod Taylor is our starter. I think that the stats, the track record tells you that would be something that would be a hard pill to swallow. You can have him there competing with a rookie quarterback and saying, hey, Tyrod's going to start things and we're going to go from there. The last really big, I think, factor in this, just objectively from a Giants standpoint, is Daniel Jones. Like, the Daniel Jones walks away thing, it's not like, that's not an option to just be cutting ties in that way. That actually, I think, restricts what both sides are able to say or do or want to do, right? Joe Schoen come out and say, we appreciate his last year, he's moving on. You can't do it because you want to get value or compensation or something along those lines. Likewise for Daniel Jones, he knows he can get tagged, so he's going to try to force the issue here, and we'll see where it goes. The other player then, go ahead. Yeah.
One last thing I was going to say is, all of these reports that have also coming out of Daniel Jones's quote unquote camp saying that he wants $45 million. Like, it's been reported that the agent switch that he has gone through was already in the works before anything had ever happened. And the second thing is, the Giants have come out and said they haven't even started a discussion with Daniel Jones.
That was a good. They haven't even started the negotiations.
Which is why the one question I was going to ask, because I know we're talking a lot about Daniel Jones right now, is, who do you think is leaking the $45 million number to get a reaction? Is it the Giants going out there to be able to turn around and say, look, fan base, we tried our best, but this is what he was asking for? Or is it Daniel Jones putting it out there just as a teaser to be like, if they're not going to get to a higher number, which I'm earning, then, like, I can't accept a low ball offer from the Giants?
Yeah, I think it can come from both sides. And there was one other thing. I don't know who reported this, and they kind of backtracked on I didn't mean it as a negative. It was like, wow, we're seeing a bit of a different side of Daniel Jones' personality. It was like, yeah, okay, of course you are, because it's about making money. Like, if
Yeah.
you're Daniel Jones, yeah, great. You guys praised me during the year. Now maybe we're gonna have a difficult negotiation. This might be the only big contract I get after my rookie deal. Like, I need to earn the most possible. The other big factor here, I'll just say, is like we all were happy, maybe excited about what we saw from Daniel Jones this past year. It was a relatively healthy year for him. Like, it's so funny that we've gotten so far away from the neck injury a year prior. We actually thought for a minute in the offseason we could hear some very like concerning information around Daniel Jones, health concerns. Can he come back and play? Now he was healthy, he played, and we're all excited. It's only one more injury away from that being a factor. So it's like, in some ways, this past year was a perfect storm of a lot of things. Brian Dable does great in his first year as head coach. Daniel Jones shows some progress. Daniel Jones is healthy. Saquon Barkley is healthy. We're going to talk about now, right? Like, all those things coalesce from what you had available to have somewhat the best version of it outside of maybe Kenny Golladay. But like, the best version of a lot of things really happened here to put the Giants and Daniel Jones in this position to have these negotiations.
Yeah, and you mentioned Daniel Jones's health. That obviously was a big factor in leading them to the playoffs. Consistency, continuity from the quarterback position. But you mentioned it. The other piece of the equation is Saquon Barkley. This was
Yeah.
one of his best seasons since his rookie year, and it's because he was healthy out there contributing to this team. And now, because of his ability to perform throughout the entire season and help complement what Daniel Jones was doing, the Giants have a decision to make with him. And it kind of feels like so far they're prioritizing figuring out Daniel Jones's situation before they can even negotiate with Saquon.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting with Saquon Barkley, and I had said this going back previously. I think we discussed at the end of the year and just the end of the season wrap up, what's going to happen here. So there's also been the reports that the Giants can try to play that tag against both of these players and say, hey, if we don't come to an agreement, we'll tag you and then we'll spend the money on Saquon, or vice versa. However, I didn't believe that the Giants would tag Saquon Barkley, mostly because I don't think Saquon Barkley will play on the tag. Same thing. Guy was healthy, came back from injury, did all the right things. But if the reports are accurate that he was thinking about wanting to get paid Christian McCaffrey money, and the Giants were saying, like at the trade deadline, middle of the season, 12.5 million, and meeting in the middle around 14 is not something the Giants feel willing to do. I do wonder where this goes. I won't be shocked if it's Saquon Barkley goes and tests free agency, maybe comes back, but goes to market and sees what other teams are willing to offer him. And then the Giants at least allow the league to tell them, what do we have to pay Saquon Barkley? Because there is a world where Barkley goes out there and some teams are saying, 2-year deal, maybe, right? And one of the other sticking points right now, it seems to be that the Giants would like to do a 3-year deal and Barkley would like a 4-year deal, right? So that's a big sticking point too. You can put the language in the contract that makes the years voidable, etc. But I think it's the guaranteed money that Saquon's after here and the security from that standpoint.
Yeah, for me, this feels very simple, and maybe I'm just a simpleton thinking this way, but the Giants want to get the long term deal done with Daniel Jones to be able to figure out the cap situation, to be able to make moves for the season. That also opens up the ability to franchise tag Saquon Barkley. Joe Schoen cares so much about draft capital that I can't see him letting an asset like Saquon Barkley walk out the door for nothing. Like, to me, that seems like such a bizarre thing for Joe Schoen to do if he has the ability to
Yeah.
tag Saquon. Now, you mentioned maybe Saquon's like, I don't want to play on a $10 million tag. No, thank you. But at least you have the player under contract and you think about like, okay, well, let's find a situation somewhere else where they give us a second round pick or a third round pick and you can go get your $40 million guaranteed. It would almost, and this is a strong word, but it would feel like malpractice to let an explosive player like Barkley walk out the door with literally nothing.
Yeah, and I'll clarify, like tagging Barkley in order to trade him eventually, like in order to continue negotiations, like that can happen too, by the way. Like you can tag to just extend the timeline here, beginning of March, you need to submit these offers, but all right, we're putting the tag on you, and then we'll continue to, as the old phrase, negotiate in good faith on building out that longer contract. So I think there is like a small risk factor there. Like say if you're Saquon and they go, well, we'll tag you, but don't worry, we're going to figure this out. And he goes, okay, great. And then they go, shoot, we didn't figure it out. Son of a, maybe this extends into the season. Maybe at the trade deadline, things look different. Like there's a lot of different ways it could go specifically with Saquon Barkley that do make it fascinating to me.
I have a question for you about
All right.
Saquon specifically. So you see, we talked about Christian McCaffrey money, and then he came out and said, I'm not trying to reset the market. Clearly that was not his agent talking. His agent's like, I'm going to get you $11 billion, like from whatever team it is. Right.
And he said, I want real money. I don't want fake
Yes,
numbers.
not
I don't
monopoly
want
money. I want real
cajillion. I
tangible
want
money.
real money. Yeah.
Yes. But what I find fascinating, do you think the fact that Aaron Jones, the star running back of the Green Bay Packers, decided to take a pay cut to be able to stay with the team? He dropped his salary from about 16 to 11 million, but got more guaranteed money in the process. He lowered how much money he's going to make. He also doubled the amount of money he misses out on for every missed game that he has upcoming. It seems like there's starting to be a correction in the market for the top paid running backs, where no one's really going to pay 16, 17, maybe $18 million for a running back. And now it does feel like, people are even talking about Tony Pollard, the $12 million range, the 3 for 36 feels like the number that everyone feels most comfortable going to with running backs.
Well, you know what? Actually, this is funny too, because we've talked like positions, values, wide receiver saw this big of a balloon, Christian Kirk with the Jaguars, right? And now you hear that Hopkins was going to maybe want to leave Arizona, but to go somewhere and get another new deal and increase his money. I meant to bring this up around the quarterback spot of like, is there a threshold where the league and teams need to recalibrate and reset how quarterbacks approach things? And likewise for running backs, I think you're right. Like, you can find a way to finagle it. Like I love and maybe for Daniel Jones too, but for Saquon Barkley, it's like, I love an incentive-based contract. If you want to tell me that the base, like if you're the Giants and you're Joe Schoen and you say $10 million base salary, but guess what? For every touchdown you score, it's another $200,000, right? You can end up making $2-3 million over the course of the season on that. If you go over 1,200 yards, right? If you hit those
make
marks,
the Pro Bowl, get
exactly.
to the NFC Championship game, any of these big time ticket items, yeah,
exactly. And now, does that feel insulting to a Saquon Barkley? Like if it's between Saquon and Daniel Jones, I think Daniel Jones would be like, hey, put in the incentives because I'm going to get there. I'm young. I'm going into my first big opportunity here, really after a tumultuous rookie contract. But for Saquon Barkley, you point back at the stats and you go, listen, I get I've had some injuries. Like, you want to put incentives? 250, a $4 million bonus if I play 16 games this year. Health. You want to put it on health? Fine. Everything else, though, my production is there and it shows. But yeah, I think at some point, I think the league does need to say, and this is what's hard. Okay, there's 2 or 3 top shelf quarterbacks in the league. Everybody else, you're guys that if we do everything right around you, we can win and you can be better. You can be a top half quarterback, but it can't be that it's just, 50, 45, 40, 42, 41, and down the line you go. At some point, it needs to be there's 30, and this number will move up over time, obviously, but there's the $30-ish million range quarterbacks and there's the $50 million quarterbacks. Because guess what? We need to have the money to make the team better around you. And it can't be that we sacrifice that extra draft capital or extra cap space, when we look at those kind of situations.
The issue that you have there when we talk about resetting the market, it's something that I think about with Daniel Jones too. We talk about by the end of this season, if he were to get anything under 40 million, he'd be like the 12th highest paid quarterback on an average annual salary. But the thing that I ask you, Adam, let's just say Daniel Jones is a complete unrestricted free agent, no draft capital associated, nothing. If he is out on the open market, do you think that he gets a deal from a desperate team? Like, I don't know. Do the Houston Texans say we could just sign Daniel Jones and draft a transformational defensive end? Do the Carolina Panthers say we've screwed this up? Do the Jets say we're just a quarterback away? He's already played in New York. Like, how much money does he get on the open market? Because I really do think that shapes what the Giants would offer him.
Yeah, see, I think so just in terms of teams, right? We know Jets are a good example, right? Derek Carr has been talked about. Maybe they're going to go after Aaron Rodgers. So, and if you say open market, no compensation required, Daniel Jones is just out there. If I was the Jets, I would say, well, Aaron Rodgers, that's a needle mover, blah, blah, blah. Derek Carr has had success. He's good. Hasn't been a playoff successful quarterback, right? Jimmy G, you might look at even more favorably because at least you can say, hey, when you have a good team, I'm a guy that wins a lot of regular season games, can win playoff games, might not be good enough to win in the Super Bowl, but I can get you there. If I was the Jets, yeah, I'd be saying Daniel Jones, hey, I'll pay you 35, $40 million maybe on a 3-year deal, right? Say the Giants say, hey, 3 years at 35 average annual. And the Jets go 42 for 3. Why? Because we got the team in place. It's not a huge long-term commitment. And we believe that, like, we are what? 30% better as a roster than the Giants currently are. We already have the weapons in place. And we think that, hey, a 15th, 14th, 13th best quarterback in the NFL, that takes us into a deep playoff run where a Zach Wilson dumpsters us and makes us miss, right? Like, so I think it matters. Colts are another team like that too to me. A lot of weapons, a lot of talent, ready to win. Mobility, Daniel Jones' mobility, I think, is a big factor when you talk about other teams and saying, what did we have last year? And how incrementally better would we be if we had a guy that could scramble and run for 5, 6, 700 yards?
Yeah, and that's the hard part because I keep thinking on the open market, Daniel Jones is worth that whatever someone's willing to pay him. Now, you can scoff at the Giants paying him saying situationally we're not ready, our team isn't built for this, we're not ready to commit to a quarterback long term. That's fine. But I mean, the issue that you have is if other teams, multiple teams are willing to pay him say $40 million, does that mean that he's a $40 million quarterback? Like that's the hard thing in my mind to wrap
Right.
around. But Adam, the other thing that I feel like, and we have talked about Daniel Jones, we've talked a little bit about Saquon Barkley. It
Mm-hmm.
feels like every single other domino for the Giants offseason is basically like stopped, come to a screeching halt until these two things are addressed. We talk about, Julian Love is a guy who's a free agent. Jihad Ward is another guy who's a free agent. There's Darius Slayton, free agent. It feels like all of these other guys are being put on the back burner because Joe Shane's like, I don't know how much cap space we're going to have. I don't know what we're doing yet. If you guys can just sit tight until we figure all this out, that'd be great.
Well, and it's true of, say, like the Kenny Galladay situation, the Leonard Williams situation, like, and Leonard Williams specifically, right? Because let's assume they're going to eat the dead cap and get Kenny off the roster. Okay, but when you talk about other guys you may want to bring back, Leonard Williams, how far do we need to restructure your contract? How far do we need to spread the money out? Do we want to extend you? Is it a necessity or is it a desire? If Daniel Jones is on the franchise tag and it's $32.5 million on the books, well, we got to get Leonard Williams down to $4 million to be able to have some flexibility to do something, right? Whereas if you spread that money back, all of a sudden you go, well, Leonard Williams, yes, we want to bring it down, but it's not to the point where, as Joe Shane's always said, I don't want to hurt our ability to make future moves, right? It doesn't have to feel as critical to make as seismic an adjustment. And that could be adding 2 years onto a deal as opposed to one, and converting some money into a bonus as opposed to multiple years into that contract, right? So I think you're right in that sense. One of the things, the last thing I do want to touch on here is the draft, but one of the things we'll do starting next week would be, I think we did a little bit of this, is here are the free agents, who's coming back, who's not, right? And obviously the Daniel Jones and Barkley situation looms over top of it. I have some pretty easy yes, no's, I think, across this roster. But based on what happens with those decisions, now you're turning around and saying, like, remember, do we have any money to spend in free agency? How much can we spend? Or is it solely about the NFL draft? And that's the thing I want to close out on here. Closing thoughts on just on that stuff before we.
I think it's fascinating because we talk about all the Giants free agents. We talk about Daniel Jones. We talk about Saquon Barkley, Slayton, Julian Love, etc. There is a comical thing where it's like, well, we need to improve this team and go out in free agency and get people. It's like, okay, well, if we re-sign all of the players that we had on our team this year, there's no cap space to go out and make big free agent moves. And you're pretty much left with the same team that everyone was griping about, the wide receivers, the linebackers, the offensive line, etc. So, like, you can't have it both ways. You can't bring everybody back and also add a big name free agent at one of these key areas. You have to make strategic decisions. Maybe that does mean Julian Love walks. Maybe that means we lose Slayton and others. Like, I think everyone wants to bring everyone back and add to it, and that's just not the way the salary cap lends itself.
And that's, again, inside of this conversation around Jones and around Barkley, it's what's then left behind them, right? And by the way, maybe the Giants, maybe Joe Schoen in his heart of hearts is saying, maybe Daniel Jones is our bridge quarterback. Like, maybe that's what it is too. Like, I'll admit that I thought it was either going to be, hey, it's the long-term deal, or they're not going to, there's going to be a problem, let's say. Let's put it that way. That's what Daniel Jones is going to want. And if he is the guy, then why wouldn't the Giants want him here long-term? I'm far closer to saying, like, I think the Giants are closer to either tagging him or saying a 3-year deal and reassess. Because then when Jones is 27, 28, you go, did it work out? Didn't it work out? Because at 27, 28 years old, you can still sign him to another big contract and have success going forward. The last thing that I want to hit here was the draft, just specifically because it's kind of regardless of what happens here. Now, if Jones isn't the Giants quarterback, then it changes a lot of things in a big way. But when you go over and just generally look at big boards, it's interesting to me. The Giants are picking there. Man, every time I look at these two, it's like pick what would have been 21, Miami Dolphins, forfeit. I mean, that's just brutal. Don't be a franchise like that. Be happy we don't have those problems.
Yikes.
But when you go over and look at this, we know that there's going to be several guys at the top of the draft from a QB perspective, from Stroud and Young, even a guy like Anthony Richardson, he's going to be going higher somewhere. Someone's going to move up to get him. Actually, and as I ran one of these mock boards, it's the Jets who end up getting him moving at their 13th pick overall. Have fun with that, Gang Green. But when you start to move towards the Giants, the thing that I'm fascinated by is I've heard a lot of fans have come out lately. When you look at where that board is, and like, will Zay Flowers be there or not? Is he a good enough wide receiver to pay that money? Robinson, the running back out of Texas, you're not going to spend first round value, even if you didn't have Saquon Barkley here. And then it's like this tight end thing keeps coming up. And this is why this is almost the sole reason why I want to bring this up on today's episode. The best player available model is very likely for the Giants at that point of the draft. There's some linebackers that'll be there potentially for them when we talk about guys like a Miles Murphy out of Clemson. There's other names that we can look at there. Certainly they could be available. But I just find it fascinating. And oh, by the way, I want to mention Anton Harrison, the tackle out of Oklahoma. For any of you that think maybe, we're going to have a problem with Evan Neal, do we want to kick him inside? I've pushed back against that vehemently after 1 year, but there's some options. I just find it really weird that fans are saying in the best player available scenario, that tight end lives anywhere in that spectrum. Like, I actually think the problem the Giants are going to run into is probably saying, like, is anybody else interested in Zay Flowers or in other players at this point? A trade back might make more sense than anything else. Just to your point about Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, we pay the contracts, we tag. Julian Love is gone. Maybe it is, Darius Slayton's not back. Richie James isn't going to be back. Ward isn't going to be back. These aren't critical mass players, but it's just more holes on the roster. And at some point you have to say, I need more draft picks to fill more needs. I was just curious to get your perspective there, because that 22 to 28 kind of range, there's guys you can like, but there's not a lot of guys that I love. And there's definitely not a tight end that I was blown away by the amount of people that said draft a tight end there at the 25th overall pick. Like, who is it?
Michael Mayer is one of the big ones.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and he might be great. So I don't know. Go ahead, man, because my mind was blown away by that idea.
I have a very simple philosophy when it comes to first round draft picks. I don't know. This seems very rudimentary to me, and tell me if I'm an idiot, Adam. But my simple answer is
I can guide you.
You're like, I have no problem calling you an idiot if you're an idiot. Let me tell you. The simple thing for me is, look, first round draft picks get the 5th year option. No other draft picks get that. When you look at what the most expensive positions are to go out and get in free agency, or the biggest uptick from a rookie contract into their second contract, you look at positions like edge rusher, which are getting over $20 million. You look at wide receiver. Tyreek Hill reset the market at like $27 million. You look at quarterback. You look at left tackle, right tackle. You look at specific positions where the number just balloons when you have to go out and solve that problem. So for me, I'm looking at one of those key areas where it just costs astronomically to solve that problem in free agency. So you talk about looking at the wide receiver. You talk about looking at, the quarterback or running back position. Obviously, the Giants are set there. But I really think it needs to be a position where if you have to solve that problem outside of the draft, it's going to cost you $20-something million to fix it. Because having team control of something like that, a top talent for 5 years on a rookie deal, is the reason why the Eagles were able to stock the cupboard the way that they did. So for me, tight end is not that situation. It is not a huge area of need, seeing that Bellinger flashed a little bit where he was, and knowing that you could get a veteran for like $3 million on the open market to have to compete with Bellinger, be in 2 tight end sets. If you can get that type of production for $3 million, it's not worth how much value there is in that first round pick.
No, 100%. And it's a great point you bring up, man. The 5th-year option on a tight end. Thank goodness. Like, I'm sorry, unless you're
What are we
talking about
doing here?
the
Yeah.
transcendent Travis Kelce's of the world, which you usually don't even know at the time that you draft them, you're absolutely out of your mind. And that's a really good point that you bring up. I think the Giants, again, if they can finagle back and still stay in the first round to be able to grab somebody, certainly. So that being the case, my friends, here's what we're going to tell you right now at the end of the day. First of all, as somebody mentioned here in the chat, welcome back, Andy. Yeah, we
Thanks.
weren't sure. By the way, Andy may not know, people may not know this. When I host the Locked On Nets podcast and I do the cold intro and we come into the show, I reference that I host the One Giant podcast, and I usually say with my boy Andy Mack. But sometimes when we're crunched for time, we got a lot to talk about, I leave Andy off. I got in the YouTube last video saying it was no Andy Mack ? So it was concerning. People across the sports landscape are wondering, like, has it all come crumbling down around Andrew Makowitz? But
I was holding out. I was in Turks and Caicos with Daniel Jones, waiting on the new numbers that we were crunching. We had our accountant going in the background. I just said, maybe I'll switch agents. That's where I was at for a little while. We got the deal done. Adam, I'm back. I'm excited to let everyone know. There was a little touch and go there, but we're good.
That being the case, the other big thing is, so you go over to YouTube, obviously you subscribe. We crested over while Andy was trying to negotiate with Daniel Jones. We cleared that 2,000 subscriber mark. It's absolutely incredible for us. The podcast feed is doing great as well. So subscribe and support everywhere because we really do appreciate it. And the conversation, like on an episode like this, has been great. So we really do appreciate that. Next week when we come back talking draft, someone mentioned the question about highest compensatory picks that can be received if certain players went out. We'll break down that stuff next week too, because it matters around if Daniel Jones was gone, if Saquon leaves in free agency, and we don't anticipate the Giants spending a lot in free agency, we can project forward to what that'll mean for them. One other little footnote, friends. You may know me as the guy that hosts the One Giant podcast and also as the guy that hosts over on Locked On Nets with my boy Doug Norrie. In addition, starting this week, I will be launching a New Jersey Devils podcast with my cousin, a season ticket holder over there. We've been going to a lot of games this season. That team is having a lot of fun. They've got their trade deadline coming up. So that's going to be the Devils Puck Luck podcast. Go check that out on YouTube and start subscribing to it. We really appreciate the support as we launch that endeavor. And I even got another little one coming up too around the New York Red Bulls. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a proud season ticket holder of that establishment. So we're going to start talking.
You are a floozy, Adam. You just jump from fandom to fandom. The good news is
those are all separate sports.
All different sports, all different seasons. But man, the limelight of these teams, you want to just make sure it's not about you. It's about shining a light on the success of these great organizations, is what
like it is with the One Giant podcast, like with Locked On Nets. So, but be ready for some of that stuff, man, because I'm continuing to expand my ever growing reach around the tri-state area landscape of podcasts.
They call it the fiefdom. They call it a fiefdom, Adam.
There we go. Look at me. That's me. I'm Mr. Fiefdom. So support that if you can. Really appreciate it. We'll be back next time talking all things New York Football Giants. We will get into a mock draft. People asked Andy. We will just at least tell you where are some players around these boards, and go check out adam.armbrecht on Substack, where I've been highlighting those wide receivers. Linebackers are coming up here next. Key names that we can start to look at early in this draft. And for the first time in a long time, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.